Good afternoon, and welcome to Industry Needs, the State of Manhattan. My name is Jose Ortiz Jr., and I'm the CEO of the New York City Employment and Training Coalition. Thank you to all our members and partners that have joined us this afternoon. A special thank you to Amazon, Google, Bonse Bank, and Verizon for sponsoring this series. NYC ETC supports the workforce development community to ensure that every New Yorker has access to the skills, training, and education needed to thrive in the local economy, and that every business is able to maintain a highly skilled workforce. NYC ETC's membership is composed of 190 workforce providers, education institutions, and labor management organizations that provide jobs and training and employment services to nearly 600,000 New Yorkers. Today, and this is our fourth and final installment in our four-part Industry Needs by the Borough series, we'll discuss the state of Manhattan and strategize on measures being undertaken to keep the businesses open and workers employed. Today, we have the pleasure of hearing from a great panel of leaders that represent business interests in Manhattan. All participants should know that you'll be muted for the duration of this webinar. I'll moderate a discussion with our speakers and discuss the state of their communities and what else can be done to keep businesses open and get Manhattan workers employed. However, before we start, we'll hear from James Parrott, Director of Economic and Fiscal Policies at the Center for New York City Affairs at the New School, who, as usual, will provide a labor update on the Borough of Manhattan. James, take it away.
There we go. Thanks, Joe. It's good to see everyone and to be here again. What I want to do, if I could have the next slide, please, MJ. Thank you. I want to give you a quick idea of the COVID economic impact in New York City and Manhattan. We'll talk about how the COVID dislocation is different from a usual business cycle. We'll look at the jobs that are affected, heavily concentrated in Manhattan. Look at the residents affected across all 5 boroughs, but including many in Manhattan. Look at the workers who are affected, how the pandemic, talk about how the pandemic has reshaped the city's economy and its jobs, and what I think it will take in terms of a more effective response on the part of the city and the state to get us to recovery sooner than the trajectory that looks like we're headed for. Obviously, COVID is a continuously changing and evolving economic landscape. COVID cases now are on the decline again. That's promising. Second half of the summer and early September, it was on the rise, and that was that basically, further stalled the recovery. Tourism is gradually picking up. We'll start to see more international travelers in a few weeks. Residential real estate appears to have rebounded strongly in New York City, at least according to the sales data. Office real estate market is a different matter entirely. The state comptroller just put out a very extensive report on that situation today. The art sector is returning. Broadway plays are resuming, other performances resuming, and so on. So many positive indicators that things are beginning to improve. On the other hand, there's been a very slow return to offices, and several large companies that put off a return to office requirement on the part of their workforces until January, so that's a few months off. We've also experienced a dramatic downturn in the availability of federal unemployment benefits. Those ended basically on Labor Day. That is taking out of the New York City economy about $500 million weekly in spending. So that's a concern. And more broadly in the nation, we've seen that supply bottlenecks have been really impeding the economic rebound of many sectors. For example, the automobile production sector, and that together with energy prices rising has contributed to growing concerns about inflation. And then on top of all of that, we've had the uncertainty about the federal debt ceiling and so on. So many sort of cross currents in the economic landscape. Let's turn to New York City though. And the next slide, you'll see the trajectory over the course of the pandemic in terms of employment levels. New York City is in the gray at the bottom, the US average in blue at the top. New York City hit much harder. The rebound has been more gradual and partial than in the country overall. New York City's only regained back about 50% of the jobs we lost in those first 2 months, whereas nationally, employment levels are now down only 2.7%. So the rebound there has been in the order of 80%, 90% if you look just at the private sector employment rebounded. And you could see the unevenness here. Some recovery, in the summer and early fall of 2020. Then things stalled out with the late fall and winter resurgence in the caseload. Then we saw some fairly promising and steady employment recovery in New York City, February, March, April, May of this year, and then things started to stall over the summer, and we saw another, encouragingly, it wasn't as steep a rise in the caseload. From the next slide really underscores the fact that New York City has been hit much harder than other large cities, and New York State, among states, has been hit hardest overall. And it's now things are at the point where there's been much more recovery nationally. We're still behind the curve in terms of recovery. So we're still down about 10, 11% in terms of employment in New York City, 3.5 times more severe than at the national level. New York State overall at this point accounts for about 1 out of every 6 lost jobs since the beginning of the pandemic. In the next slide, you'll see, it's very deep. This has all of the major sectors of the city's economy. We will gladly share these slides with people afterwards to look in, so for you to look at in more detail afterwards. This gives you, we organize these sectors into 3 broad categories that we find useful: essential industries, which includes healthcare, social assistance, and government; face-to-face industry category, where the brunt of the COVID's adverse impact has been felt, hitting hard at leisure and hospitality, hotels, restaurants, retail, local transportation, private education services, the arts industry, of course, here as well. And then at the other extreme, remote working industries, where people have been able to pivot, continue working, although they haven't been present in their offices in Manhattan, certainly, which is a concern for us today. But overall, the job displacement in remote working has been like, a serious recession, but not anything like, a 20% decline as of August, compared to pre-pandemic levels in the face-to-face industry category. That magnitude of job loss can only be considered a depression level of reduction. And you can see the job rebound here, uneven across the sectors, and 47% overall for the private sector in New York City. You can see that we had some job growth in May and June, and then it slowed down. Actually, in April, May, and June, and then it slowed down in July. Was actually negative when you look at the private sector overall, and very modest improvement in August. We will get the September numbers in a couple of weeks, and we'll have a better idea then of how soon the recovery can resume in New York City. Looking at the next chart, here, so now we turn to Manhattan to look at how this job loss has played out. One caveat here, there's a lag in the availability of borough level employment, so we only have data through March of this year, but you can clearly see here that that as of March, the employment level in Manhattan was still well below where it was before, and comprised a lot of the 534,000 jobs deficit for the private sector in the city overall. Again, as of March, and you can see that the concentrated impact on the hotels and restaurants in Manhattan that COVID has had. It's also affected retail trade and the trade transportation sector, and other services, and a big impact in professional and business services. Professional services is heavily concentrated in Manhattan, and business services includes building support workers and temporary help workers. So both categories within business services that have been held back by the slow return of workers to their offices. The data in the previous chart gives us hope that the employment situation is not nearly as dire in Manhattan, because if you look at the sectors where we had growth recently, you know, in the spring and early summer, continued rebound in the restaurant sector, the beginnings of a rebound in arts, beginnings of a rebound in hotel jobs, some return of retail jobs, and so on. So you know, mainly the areas where we did see some employment rebound in the summer have taken place in Manhattan. So the situation is not quite as dire as it appears on this chart. Turning to the next one, you know, the point of this one really is to show you that while Manhattan was not hit as hard initially as Brooklyn and Queens, so the red bar shows the first 2 months job decline. When we look at the latest data we have at a borough level as of March, Manhattan was still down 17% in employment, much greater than the 8% declines at that point in Brooklyn and the Bronx, and a 12% decline in Queens. Queens hit a little harder than the other boroughs, mainly because of the airport related impact. And in this middle period, October 2020 to March of 21, that was really a period of stalled recovery across the board in New York City. In the next chart, so this begins to shift from the jobs affected to the workers who were affected. And we know from lots of indicators that 75% of the workers losing jobs in the pandemic have been workers of color. This chart shows the greater likelihood of certain demographics being affected compared to others. So less educated workers much more heavily impacted than those with a 4-year college degree. Young workers much more heavily affected than workers 55 and older. Immigrants more heavily affected than native born. And importantly, in an era, in a city where we're very concerned about economic equity, the brunt of the adverse employment and economic effects focused on low earning workers, hit much harder than workers higher up the income ladder. Now, let me shift to some, in the next slide, please. Actually, here's another one that, so even in Manhattan, we tend to think of, you know, a higher income resident population in Manhattan, a lot of people who work in some of the higher paying industries, and still 49% of New York City residents, of Manhattan residents, work in the face-to-face industries, compared to 36% working in the remote working industries, and 15% in the essential categories. I haven't said a lot about the essential categories. They obviously didn't experience steep job decline, but these, again, were workers on the front line who were subjected to greater personal health risk throughout this, and yet remained on the jobs, and as we all recognize, have demonstrated their hero status to all of us in providing essential health care and other public services. Next slide, please. Here again, a little more detail with the face-to-face category of workers highlighted in yellow in the middle, just to show the greater concentration of workers of color in that category relative to remote working, the fact that they're tend to be less educated than workers overall, and workers in the other two sectors, a high percent of foreign-born, a high percent of low-earning workers, and so on. Next slide. So just to focus for a second on some of the recent developments. So tourism is gradually returning. Vaccinated international visitors will start to return next month. That will certainly further help the tourism sector get back on its feet. New York City area airport passenger volume is still way down from where it was 2 years ago. The latest data on office occupancy, actually we have one more week of data than indicated here. It's now up to 29% as of September 29th. But it hasn't been coming back very quickly, and New York City it's clear from the comparative data with other cities, with the exception of San Jose and San Francisco and the Bay Area, all other metro areas have a much higher office occupancy in recent months than New York City. An indication of the fact that a lot of people haven't returned to the office is that subway ridership is still off by about 50%. And because of a continuing aversion to use of public transit, many more people relying on automobiles, so that we know from the MTA that bridge and tunnel traffic is about even where it was, month over month compared to 2019. And as I noted earlier, residential real estate sales appear to have recovered, but commercial vacancy is still very high. Commercial sales still weak, although the recent purchase of a large building in Tribeca by Google is a very positive sign. Next slide. Let me talk for just a minute about the reluctance of workers to return to work, and I guess the overriding thing I want to say that is, understanding the fact that there are a lot of factors at play in the decision of an individual to return to work, and there's sort of a parallel in thinking about the numerous supply constraints we see operating nationally, which is an indication that following a period when the economy was largely shut down for some period of time, we realize now that it's not so easy to just flip a switch and turn the economy back on and things start to hum along as before. And the labor market is certainly no exception to that. So people have been, they face personal health concerns about, particularly if they work in a face-to-face sector where they may be exposed to people who, many of whom are still not vaccinated at this point, although state and city, state, and federal efforts to encourage vaccination are beginning to pay off, and the vaccination rate is creeping up. There's still a significant lack of affordable childcare, promising that the public schools have reopened, although there have been a few fits and starts, but on the whole, I think that's going well. That makes it easier for a lot of people to make a choice about returning to work. But we still have limitations in the partial unemployment system. We have an unemployment system in New York, as many states do, that allow people to return to work on a part-time basis if that's all that their employer requires, and that condition is pretty widespread, as you can imagine. We've been making some improvements in the unemployment system, so that will help it. But I think overall, this has been an extended period of people not working. I think has given people the opportunity to think about whether or not they want to make a career change or go back to school and so on. And I think generally, as an economist, that it's healthy for people to periodically reassess their employment options and opportunities and make changes that I think will, if they're better for those workers personally, that's going to be better for the economy in the aggregate. So in the long run, this hesitancy about returning to work because people are rethinking what they want to do, I think that will pass, and hopefully people will see more opportunities. And of course that speaks to the issue that I want to build up to in a minute. So we could have the next slide. Just a quick note on the fact that there are many dimensions of labor market problems. We certainly still have elevated unemployment. The official unemployment rate is 11%. The underemployment rate is about 17%. Of course, it's higher for Black and Latinx workers than for white workers. At this point, a lot of people have been unemployed on a long-term basis, over 26 weeks, over 52 weeks. These number in the hundreds of thousands. There's been a sharp rise in involuntary part-time employment. Parents, as we've been saying, have been kept out of the labor force because of caregiving and child rearing responsibilities, and there are continuing concerns about health risks. Next slide. So let me comment on one of the reasons I think that New York City hasn't responded in a more forceful manner at this point. The official economic forecast behind the city budget that sort of guides decision-making in City Hall indicated that New York City would regain 400,000 jobs in 2021. That is between December of 2020 and December of this year. The IBO projected a gain of 350,000. So where do things stand? As of 8 months into the year, 2/3 of the way through 2021, we've regained only 102,000 jobs. We are well behind the pace forecast by either OMB and City Hall or the IBO in terms of regaining jobs. So I think this to me suggests that the unemployment picture is more dire than what budget makers and City Hall decision makers anticipated. And I think it's important for them to update their forecast, take stock of where we're at now, and adjust policies if needed. And I spoke a minute ago about the economic impact of the ending of federal unemployment benefits. We estimate that affects 750 to 800,000 New York City residents, losing an average of $500 to $600 a week. My final slide, let me just wrap up. One more picture to look at and then a wrap up slide. So what's the consequence if we don't have a more significant intervention at this point? This chart shows the average unemployment rate by demographic group, by white, Black, and Latinx workers in these previous economic downturn and recovery periods. And the takeaway from this is, if you look at the orange bar representing Black workers, they experienced several years of double-digit unemployment rates following previous economic downturns. The pandemic is different from those downturns. It's different in its concentrated impact on industries predominated by workers of color. And it's different in the fact that the magnitude of the decline is far greater than anything in these previous business cycle downturns. Latinx workers almost as hard hit. So if we don't do more than what we're doing now, our future looks to me like double-digit unemployment rates for the next 2 to 3 years at least for Black and Latinx workers, which leads me to the final slide. So we can skip over that one. The takeaways here: New York City's been hit much harder than the nation overall. Our recovery has gone through fits and starts. Hopefully, with the caseload coming down, we're entering a period where we will see more concerted recovery. But we need to do more than what we're doing now. Otherwise, the prospect is that we're going to have elevated unemployment levels, and all of the attendant social and economic challenges and problems and implications for inequity and racial inequity in particular that go along with that. So that wraps up my assessment of the current state of the city and Manhattan economy. Thank you.
Thanks, James. And appreciate it as always. Obviously, always in the last few months, especially, just incredibly sobering, but important work ahead for all of us. So thank you, James. I'll now introduce our credible panel, 3 powerful voices and leaders from New York City's business community. First, we have Melva M, Chief Executive Officer of the Association for a Better New York, or ABNY. Merrill Pond, Executive Vice President for the Partnership for New York City. And Jessica Walker, President and Chief Executive Officer at the Manhattan Chamber of Commerce. Thank you all for joining. It's good to see you.
Thanks for having us.
Great to be here.
Yeah, great to be here.
So we're going to just jump into just a couple of moments for each one of you, just to provide a little bit more color into your work, specifically the role that you play and the work that you do as an organization in New York City. And we'll start with Melva.
Sure. Thanks again for having me. It's always a pleasure to be with my colleagues who are on here. My name is Melva M, and I run an organization called ABNY, which stands for the Association for a Better New York. And for over 50 years actually this year, we've been bringing together decision makers across industry sectors for the common purpose of making the city a safer and better place for all, right? And we take pride in this role as a convener, really built on the respect of each other, our communities, the people who live in our communities, and for the great city that we all love. Through this next phase of our organization, we have really been focused on growing New York City in a way that keeps the city a place for industry to thrive and be that center of innovation that we've known to be, as well as making sure that we are truly a place of inclusion, equity, and equality, and fairness across all 5 boroughs. And we really base this on 3 pillars of work for growth for us, and that's investing in the people of New York, the communities of New York, and attracting industries and keeping industries here, all large, small, and medium sized. So that's us.
Thanks, Melva. That's great. Merrill, you're up.
Hi, well, thank you for having me. Merrill Pond, I'm Executive Vice President of the Partnership for New York City, and I feel like so much of what Melva said I can also say. I will add that we represent 300 of the largest companies in the city, and our overall mission is to use the capital and the resources of those large businesses to work on the challenges that are facing the city in partnership with the nonprofit, labor, and public sectors.
Thanks, Merrill. And Jess?
Hi. So the Manhattan Chamber of Commerce is all about trying to help businesses thrive in New York City. It's a tough town. And so what we're trying to do is really give them the tools, resources, policy, and advocacy to overcome all the challenges here and really grow the economy. I would say about 80% of our members are small businesses. So that's sort of the interesting take that we can speak about today. And then finally, just through the crisis, we have worked with other partners, including the Partnership for New York City, to really be on the ground. We have about 7 or 8 staff members who are out there going door to door to really try to help businesses, make it right now, know about the resources that are available.
Thanks, Jess, and thank you all for being here again. It's really great to see you all, and I think you all bring an incredible amount of expertise, but also particular perspective on this conversation that we're going to have today. And I want to, before we jump into the large list of questions that we have, and obviously we'll try to narrow it down for the sake of time. What's your immediate reaction? And we'll start with Melva. What's your immediate reaction to James's update?
Yeah, so I think my takeaway from his presentation today was his statement about doing more than we've done in the past. If we look at the trajectory of unemployment, especially among African Americans and Latinos in New York City, we want to make sure we do something different so that we are not in double-digit unemployment for the next, half a decade or decade. But I have a few other immediate responses to the data that he presented. So one, right, I'm not surprised by the job loss statistics due to the nature of the types of industries hit hardest by COVID and the health inequalities that exist in some of New York City's poorest neighborhoods. There's no surprise, right, that New York City has been negatively affected far greater than other cities across this nation. Communities with limited or no access to adequate health care, right, that includes healthy food options, regular medical appointments, healthcare facilities with limited resources, including New Yorkers with low-wage service jobs that we were devastated when the city shut down. There's no surprise there. But another point that I felt was really interesting that we've heard from a number of our members is that Manhattan's COVID job losses have been persistent with the greatest losses in leisure and hospitality for a number of reasons, right? Including the things that James mentioned. And what we've seen as a major contributors to that includes employers' decisions to offer things like hybrid work options or even move operations to locations outside of Manhattan, both contributing to the number of job losses in Manhattan particularly. Another thing I thought was really interesting, I have a couple more, so I promise not to take too much time, but it was really great data. The data point about workers of color accounting for 75% of the losses of jobs citywide, right? We know the connection between socioeconomic conditions and people of color and how that has the effect of being more likely that the concentration of job losses in BIPOC communities, right? I mean, the intersection between poor health outcomes, between low wage earnings, right? The types of industries that were affected the most, lack of childcare support, right? Insufficient workforce development skills, housing insecurity have all led to the stark differences in job losses that we're seeing. So, I think that there are a number of really interesting points in the report. I will say, and the last thing is that, I know some of the business sectors were looking forward to the end of unemployment benefits, but the fact is, and the data shows us that without this kind of support, many New Yorkers would not and could not rebound from the economic hardships of COVID, right? The outcomes that COVID brought. The fact is that many New Yorkers still can't return to the workforce due to, again, things James talked about, right? Childcare issues or taking care of vulnerable loved ones who can't risk the health of those loved ones entering back into the job force. So this data, so eloquently put together by James, really tells the story that there's no simple answer to this unsettled job market, right? There are many factors that need to be considered when incentivizing the New York City workforce to come back. And hopefully this data will show us that employers need to think creatively and compassionately about ways to bring our workers back.
Thanks, Melva. And Jess, Merrill, do you want to expand on your thoughts on the report, but also considering that, think about, how it's affected the businesses that are members of your organizations, and we'll talk a little bit about the workforce landscape over time as well. But really, what's your immediate response, and how has this impacted your members specifically? Either one of you, feel free to jump in.
Well, I would just want to, the big takeaway for me is that the unpopular reality is that Manhattan really has become ground zero in New York City for this crisis. And Manhattan, it's obvious because Manhattan is a place where most of the city's businesses are located, but more than that, these businesses employ the majority of New Yorkers, the majority of people in our region. And so if Manhattan suffers, it affects everything in the city, jobs, the tax base, tourism. It's just everything is here. And so I think it's not popular to say that, although that's what the data shows us that James is talking about. And I think that we really do need to think about that. There was a report that came out today by REBNY that showed that the vacancy rate in areas around Grand Central and Midtown East are very, very low. And all of that is very concerning. So, I think that this is the conversation to be having. It really is about Manhattan at this point. And again, it's not politically popular, and I get that, but that's the reality of the situation.
No, we certainly, I don't disagree with you, and I expect to hear that from you as a Manhattan advocate. So that's fine. Merrill, anything else you want to add?
Yeah, I wanted to say, I mean, unfortunately, nothing that James presented was surprising, continues to be sobering that we're still at this point, 18, 19 months into this. I would say the distressing point at the end around that we might be looking at double-digit employment rates for Black and Latinx workers for several years to come is incredibly distressing. And that's going to be something that the city is really going to have to focus on to make sure that that doesn't come to pass. Would say, in addition, just to add to what Jessica and Melva have been saying, we've been surveying our members on their return to office plans since last June 2020. And our latest survey, which we released a few weeks ago, 41% of Manhattan office-based employees were expected back by the end of September. Originally, our members had been saying that closer to 62% would be back by September. So that's a big drop. They're also saying back by January, 76%. So we're still not at 100% even by January. And then of those, 70% are adopting a hybrid schedule. So in the office 3 days a week, home for 2, which all has incredible impacts on the small businesses that support those. So this is very concerning to us. It's very, as an organization that is trying to give all the information we can to our members to help them get their employees back to the office for many reasons, but mostly for the vibrancy of Manhattan, as Jessica pointed out, as well as to support the small and medium-sized businesses that depend on them. The other data point I'd just add, MasterCard released a report yesterday that looked at the pandemic's impact on small businesses. Unsurprisingly, in April 2020, in-person spending at Manhattan small businesses was 33% of 2019 levels. By August 2021, spending had recovered to 73% of 2019 levels. So a good improvement, but still a way to go.
Yeah, thanks for that. And obviously those statistics are pretty stark. And I do remember, the information you had shared around this time last year around, expectations around businesses coming back in, and now, coming back this time around. Obviously, there was so much unknown around the variants and the different position we would be in now. That were just very high expectations about 18 months it needed to really get back to normal. Considering all these different factors, and I just want to stay with you, Merrill, for a second. How have the businesses in your membership and just broadly in terms of the information that you're seeing on the ground shifted their talent approach and their hiring practices? Obviously, and Melva alluded to this around the potential loss of some of the benefits, unemployment benefits, and obviously a need that populations still require some of these benefits. And to some degree, I think this is required, I think, a lot of the businesses to be very creative about how they hire and what they're thinking about doing in terms of attracting talent back in. What are you seeing within your membership?
I think generally, as we all know, the Black Lives Matter movement really permeated through corporate America and forced executives to look inward. And diversity now is being looked at not only from a company-wide point of view, but at which levels of management we're seeing diverse populations of workers and non-diverse populations of workers. And we're certainly hearing from our members that they're hiring diversity, equity, and inclusion leaders to work in tandem with their HR teams to access new talent pipelines. Of course, this all takes time. It takes a change in approach, but also a change in culture at each individual company. And I think companies are also starting to realize that it's not just hiring at the entry level positions, but they need to focus on retention and upward mobility. So as important as internships and apprenticeships are, those are only the very first step in getting individuals back into the workplace and also accessing populations that haven't normally had access into many of these jobs.
Thanks, Merrill. Jess, Melva, what are you seeing with your membership? How have they shifted their hiring practices during this time? Obviously, it's an incredibly challenging time to attract talent for a variety of different reasons. And I think that, as I already mentioned, this intersectionality is really key here in thinking about people coming back to some of these jobs that they valued over time, but maybe it's just a little bit more difficult for them to come back into a situation which is, there's some health concerns, and there's obviously the economic concerns that exist. And childcare continues to be in flux. Transportation is still a major concern for folks getting back on the subway. The concerns have just piled on each other, and makes it even more challenging for, I imagine, many of your members.
Yeah, no, I've definitely heard it, and across different industries too. This is not just restaurant and retail, but some of my members, for example, who have Black car companies, it's hard right now to hire people. And I think James did a good job of pointing out several of the different challenges there. I think also we have to understand that some people have left the city. And hopefully they will return, but I think that is a real part of this as well that has made it difficult. One thing I will say, and I know, Jose, you are a proponent of, and you've been working on for a long time, is that we do need to give small businesses more help in their hiring practices. Right now, so many of them are trying to hire not just one or two people, but to bring their entire staffs back, which is really hard. And so that means writing job descriptions, doing interviews, vetting people, understanding all the compliance issues, what you can and cannot ask in a job interview, for example. So that is a huge issue that I think we need to ramp up quickly.
So if I can jump right in and echo what both Merrill and Jess has talked about, and Merrill, I really want to thank you for sort of bringing this up, but I just want to underscore this a little more. Like, we haven't really talked about sort of how the parallel dealing with the negative fallout from COVID and how our country has been dealing with the social unrest associated with racially biased violence and institutional inequality that came to a head over these last 18 months or so, right? And they're running concurrent, and they've brought up a number of issues that we see now reflected in hiring practices, right? So as a result of this perfect storm, there has been an overwhelming and interesting commitment to addressing both the health inequities and structural and institutional racism in all systems, public and private, right, within our society. And that includes the need to diversify our talent and leadership, right? Talent in workforce, talent in leadership, in positions like corporate, nonprofit, and municipal boards, right? And other decision-making positions. So this has been a surge in an effort to embrace people of color in environments that have historically been low in count, as sort of Merrill talked about. Now, we can talk about how to do this genuinely and with intention, and maybe that's another panel discussion to actually how to make that happen. But what I will say about this approach, what we've seen at ABNY is some interesting information from our members. Now, at ABNY, we don't regularly survey our members. We look to the amazing data that's available from the partnership that the partnership has pulled together over these last 2 years on many of the things that are important to our membership. However, from the limited data that we have and from the anecdotal conversations that we've had, we know employers are not only looking deeper into communities across the 5 boroughs to find talent, they're also thinking about the types of benefits that they can offer to lure employees in, right? And I see some comments in the chat box. So, that means not only partnering with community-based workforce development organizations and educational institutions, both private, right? Looking at sort of the affinity groups within the private colleges, but also looking at places like CUNY, but thinking about how and when to mandate vaccine requirements, right? Really important, because we know that This is a deterrent for many communities across New York City, or how to offer incentives like providing support for childcare or paid private transportation to and from work and other things. But we've also seen practices like looking to promote from within, right? Merrill talked about that, right? Looking at diversity, looking at workforce in a way where we have the talent in our businesses and our organizations and our nonprofits. How do we promote up? Change the culture of the organizations to work from a lens of diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice, right? There's a lot of conversation about that, but the perspective we're seeing has changed. But also understanding the importance of attracting talent from other places, like outside the US, right? So I see a lot of our members getting involved in the conversations about the immigration policies, right? So that they can make sure that New York City is attracting the type of talent, the diverse talent that makes our city grow. And just to sort of qualify some of the things that I've been saying in terms of our membership, right? 76% of our members are based in New York City. So these are the conversations that we're having with the majority of our members. And the majority, only 5% are above 60th Street. So most of the members are actually in the central business districts where we've seen been hit the hardest in Manhattan around the negative effects of COVID. So we're seeing some interesting trends, and we are committed to working with our members and others to turn the interest into action to actually get these policies implemented.
Thank you all. And you're right. I think that there was obviously, an imperfect storm that occurred over the last 18 months that really brought all these conversations together. And I think we all took part in that in a variety of different ways. And I think from a workforce standpoint, what was important was that we created, and this is a work, that the coalition helped lead and partner with lots of different organizations, really brought together businesses around this conversation around diversifying talent and really thinking creatively about hiring practices, as you mentioned, Melva. And I want to kind of go into this last set of questions, and Jess, if you don't mind starting us off with this, but really, what have you seen, or what should we be doing as workforce development organizations, from ETC to the organizations that we represent and other workforce for-profit and nonprofit organizations throughout New York City? What should we be doing in terms of working with your members and businesses across New York City to really enhance our relationship? And really, when thinking about that, obviously, and we've heard this repeatedly, and I've been saying this from the beginning of the pandemic really accelerated trends that we saw coming for a significant period of time. So when considering, the relationship that workforce development community establishes with your members and the business community at large, there's obviously a lot of work that we have to do on our end, and there's a lot of work that needs to do on both ends. But what should we be doing first to enhance that relationship?
Yeah, that's great. Well, thanks for even asking. I mean, that's the first thing. No, like I said, I think that hiring is really hard, just in general, and especially if you're not a headhunter, you don't know what to look for. You're just hiring somebody who answers the questions the right way, and you don't really know what you're getting, and that can slow everything down. You could hire the wrong person. It could create headaches because it could really slow down your business. But also, it could open you up to liability, because if it's not easy to get rid of somebody if they're not up to snuff. So, ideally, you want to prevent all of that up front. And so I do think that providing a lot more help to small businesses in undertaking the hiring process could go a long way. Not only could it really help fill the jobs that we're seeing that are open right now, fill those a lot quicker, but it could make sure that the matching is right and that we have the right people in place for the right positions. It's better for everybody. Nobody wants to be fired. Nobody wants to fire anybody. We just don't need to do that if we can get it right from the beginning. And so I think that would be a tremendous help to have that intermediary, which I do know those types of programs exist. But we are in a unprecedented time where everybody is trying to hire right now. And so we need it more than ever, and we need it quickly. Otherwise, we're really opening these small businesses up for a lot of problems. They're going to be understaffed. That means customers might not want to come back because they're not getting the quality service that they need. Or these small businesses, again, are hiring people who are not right for the job, and it can create a lot of problems down the road.
Merrill, from your experience, and you've been someone who's been really close to the workforce sector for a long time as well. What do we need to do? And obviously, there are incredible organizations that businesses and organizations that are working collaboratively and have been doing so for some time. So, from your experience, what do you think that we need to be replicating and scaling in terms of addressing this large employment gap or talent gap that Jess has referenced?
So I'll just highlight everything that Jess said as saying intermediaries are key, not only for internships, apprenticeships, but also longer term hiring. I mean, just an example, Fisher Brothers, which is one of our members, the real estate developer in Manhattan, they came to the decision that they knew that real estate is historically non-diverse. They wanted to do something about that. They contacted us as their intermediary and asked where could they go, what can they do. We connected them with BASTA, which is an organization that works with first generation CUNY students. And now Fisher is setting up an internship program to bring in a group of interns from CUNY to basically you have an experiential time throughout all of the different departments within the real estate developer. The only reason that happened was because there was an intermediary relationship on both sides. And again, on the hiring side, the same. I mean, Jessica mentioned it, the partnership in conjunction with the 5 borough chambers of commerce, the Peter G. Peterson Foundation, and the city set up the Small Business Resource Network in order to bring some resources, badly needed resources, to small businesses. We're starting some small pilots on the hiring front. That's not been the focus to date. It's more been first around PPE, then capital, legal, technical. We're trying to figure out the hiring needs, particularly with restaurants, because they're having such a hard time now. And yet we have all of these workforce development organizations that are focused on culinary. Seems like a really easy thing to do, to match the two. It is far from easy, I'm learning. So I think it's, again, that intermediary function is where we need to focus.
Thanks, Merrill. Melva?
Sure. So I think what we're doing right now, right? So I think what the workforce development partners throughout the city should continue to stay engaged with the business community and create platforms like this. And these partnerships are so important. Just, fact, ABNY has changed the way we give out our foundation grants this year. Because we wanted to directly respond to the negative effects of COVID. And thanks to you, Joey, I know it was you, we had our application sent out through your network, and we got an overwhelming number of applications, and we were able to fund some workforce development programs that we would never have known about if it were not for sort of the partnership and the relationship with this workforce development organization. So I think making sure that we continue to have this discourse between the business community and the workforce development partners will yield the type of results that we want in terms of making sure that we not only have a diverse workforce, but we have a connected workforce with the skills that are needed through this partnership. The other thing that I would say, going back to sort of my old hat in the borough president's office is, and Joey, I know you talk about this a lot and will have some influence moving forward in the next administration, but I think, the city has really, had an opportunity to create a free service for those small businesses like Jessica was talking about through targeted hiring programs, right? So the SBS, had a program of support where, to attract industry or to encourage a business in a certain area will offer this free service, that intermediary, right? Where they will screen the workforce, they will provide and connect training resources, right? But I think making those connections and having that resource on a city level through the nonprofit organizations and the other workforce development providers, I think provides a great model for bridging that gap that we were just talking about in terms of the need, the historic need in the business community, and a skilled, available, and ready to work workforce. So I think that there's a lot that the workforce development providers can do to make sure that they are connected in the know, but they can't do it alone, right? We needed to make sure that we are connected, that they are connected with other partners.
Thank you all.
I would just add to that very quickly. I see a comment in the chat around the workforce development organizations providing the supports that are needed for many of these individuals, and that's a critical piece. Like it's not as easy just to hire. We need to have those wraparound services. So that's why we need the workforce development organizations to be working hand in hand with business.
I was going to say that, but I don't want to take up so much time.
Oh.
But yes, the job readiness skills, the mentoring, sort of how to get up early in the morning. I mean, there's tons of services that I think that the workforce development partners provide that will make a partnership like this successful.
Yeah, and we talked about that. We've talked about that for a long time. Obviously, some of the work we did recently with our steering committee and our partners at ADHD and RPA around the inclusive growth initiative really talks about all these different pieces, right? We've addressed it a little bit on this call, but it is more than just the training that our organizations are providing. It's more than the job. We need to make sure that the city's up and running and folks can feel good and feel that they're going to quality work, that they have the supports around them. So we'll be leaning on all of you to help support that effort moving forward. Jess, Merrill, Melva, it's really great to see you all. Thank you for being here. I really enjoyed this panel. I enjoy seeing you all together, and I look forward to seeing you all soon. So thank you.
Thank you. Great to see you all.
A quick program note, before I provide instructions on how to participate in a breakout session, later this month, we'll transition our industry needs discussion from the boroughs to specific industries when we discuss the state of green jobs on October 28th. In November and December, respectively, we'll discuss the state of tech and the state of retail and hospitality. And we'll kick off 2022 with the state of the state of building trades and the state of media and entertainment in the months of January and February. Please learn more information about these panels and conversations at nycetc.org/events and register today.